Hey everybody, Doomwake here, and welcome to another video on the channel. MH3 season, almost in full swing. Not quite official spoiler season. I'm not 100% positive when it starts. I want to say it's in a couple of weeks, maybe closer to 3 weeks, but let me know in the comments. But what we do have is we have an article, official article from WotC today. They had gone over and discussed the leaks that previously happened over the course of the past, week and a half, and they gave us some official spoilers to talk about. I don't know if you guys know this, but I am pretty anti-leak because content creators get preview cards, that's their card, and leaks kind of take away from the content creators, so we're just going to be discussing the official spoilers, but boy, do we have a couple of them for you today, and I will link the article in the description down below. Let's start off with the first card here, Nether. This is 1 black mana for a star, and then the toughness is 1+ star. Its power is equal to the number of card types among cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that number +1. Sounds familiar? And then it has an escape cost where you can pay 2 and a black and exile any number of other cards from your graveyard with 4 or more card types among them. This is, for all intents and purposes, a 1 mana Tarmogoyf, but it only counts your graveyard, and then you can escape it. The issue is, once you start escaping it, unless you're putting multiples of the same card type into your graveyard, it's not something where you can say, escape a Kroxa, you can just exile 4 random cards. You can't exile 4 lands to this. So it's a little bit restrictive in that sense, but 1 mana for a card that has the potential to be 4, 5, 6 power seems like it could potentially be very good, especially with cards like Street Wraith, Mishra's Bauble, LOTR Land Cyclers, things of that nature. Again, I'm not quite sure how often you're going to be escaping this, but it does seem relatively powerful. You can maybe escape it if you build like a dedicated self-mill deck. The issue is, a lot of those self-mill decks really want a bunch of creatures, right? They're utilizing creatures like Priest of Forgotten Gods, Bloodghast, things like that. And I don't exactly know if that fits into that specific deck, so you'd probably have to build it a little bit differently, but a very powerful card nonetheless. Next up, we have Null Drifter. Yes, you heard that right, Null Drifter. I love the play on words, by the way. The name is pretty funny. It's a 7 mana creature, Eldrazi Elemental. It is a colorless card, 4/4 flyer. It says when you cast this spell, draw 2 cards, notably not when it enters the battlefield. It has Annihilator 1 and Evoke for 2 in a blue. The direct comparison, obviously, is Null Drifter. You can tell that by the name. And this is better and worse. It's better because even if they counter it, you're still drawing the 2 cards, but worse because it doesn't work as well with the blink effects, like Ephemerate, Not Dead After All, things like that. The one upside is the body is quite a bit better. It is a 4/4 as opposed to a 2/2, and the Annihilator 1 is, I would assume, pretty relevant, especially if you're doing this early on in the game, like turn 3, turn 4. I don't know. It works, like I said, doesn't work as well with the blink cards, better on casting. It's a weird one, right? Like in the blue-black scam decks, I don't know if they would want to play this card because it is still kind of expensive to scam it out. 3 mana plus an additional 1 for your, Not Dead After All. So maybe this is more for like an Eldrazi deck that also has some scam elements. I'm not exactly sure what that would look like. Cool card. I don't know how much play it's going to see, but a very cool card nonetheless. Next up is Harag, Erupting Null Kite. That's a mouthful. 9 mana, 6/6. You can emerge this for 6 red, which means you can cast the spell by sacrificing a creature and paying the emerge cost reduced by that creature's mana value. When you cast this spell, you may exile your hand. If you do, draw 3 cards, flying, and then at each creature spell you cast has emerge. The emerge cost is equal to its mana cost. So that means, let's say, for example, you have a Grief, right? You have this in play and you have a Grief in your hand. Your Grief has emerged to black, which means that if you sacrifice, say, I don't know, a Dothi Voidwalker to emerge your Grief, it costs 2 mana, so on and so forth. This one's kind of expensive, and also in red, I'm not sure if there's any sort of red Eldrazi decks that would be able to enable this. It's a cool effect, like giving all of your creatures emerge has some sort of context. When you cast this, you can exile your hand if you do draw 3. If you're hellbent, that could be pretty good. But I'm not seeing it with this one. Let me know in the comments what you think of this one, but I'm not a huge fan of Harag, but again, there could certainly be a deck with it, but you probably have to like build around this one and utilize the fact that all of your creatures have emerge. Now here is one that I do think is going to be quite good. Chthonian Nightmare. This is black and a colorless for an enchantment. says when it enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy. Pay X energy, sacrifice a creature, return it to its owner's hand. You might be familiar with that line of text if you're an old school player. Return target creature card with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is sort of the fixed Recurring Nightmare. A very powerful card that utilizes, well, a lot of the times with Recurring Nightmare, especially in Cube, you're just trying to cheat out some big dumb idiot. That's not what this card is about. This card is predicated on how much energy you have, so it works better with cards that are cheaper, that you can naturally go into the graveyard, maybe stuff that has enter the battlefield effects. It's amazing with Bloodghast. Bloodghast is a very good sacrifice enabler for this. Same with Stitcher Supplier. What you need to find with this specific card, you have the enablers, Bloodghast Supplier. You need to find creatures with mana value 1, 2, or 3 that have good ETB or die effects. That is really what you want to pair this with. I am definitely going to be playing with this one. I'm going to have to do a rather big Scryfall search to try and find those 3 mana cards that have ETB or die effects, but love this card a lot. I think it's a pretty appropriate, pretty good fixed version of Recurring Nightmare. I don't think we could have just Recurring Nightmare itself, but this is a nice upgrade to it, or maybe downgrade depending on how you look at it. But I like this card a lot, and I will be playing with this one quite a bit. Next up is another play on words here. Another shout out to some famous old cards here in Null Elemental Blast. I gotta say, I love the design of this card, by the way, especially with all those Leyline and Scions that have been popping up recently. This is for a single colorless mana. It's an instant. You get to destroy a multicolored permanent or counter a multicolored spell. Phenomenal card. Kills Leyline of the Guild Pact. Kill Omnath. Can kill Teferi. Renin 6. The list goes on and on. I'm sure there are endless amounts of multicolored cards that people play in Modern. And this is a really good sideboard card if your deck can produce colorless mana. Not a ton else to say about it. It's not going to be a main deck card, but it is an extremely good sideboard card for decks that can enable it. And there might be a card later on the list that might incentivize people to play colorless cards. Next up, we have another reprint, or the first reprint we've seen so far. Spoilers. Sylvan Safekeeper. This is an invitational card from way back in the day, back in Judgment. It's a 1 mana 1/1. You can sacrifice a land to give a creature you control Shroud until end of turn. Notably, they don't usually use Shroud anymore, but since this is a reprint, they don't want to do like a fixed version. They want to just give us the original card, which I can appreciate. My initial thought with this was to pair it with Yawgmoth, but then somebody had pointed out to me that Yawgmoth has protection from humans, so you cannot actually target Yawgmoth with Sylvan Safekeeper. So past that, I mean, I guess you can play this in Amulet type as a way to play this against decks that have a lot of targeted removal to protect your Titan against their removal spells. Outside of that, I'm not sure if there's a ton of other applications for Sylvan Safekeeper. Be sure to let me know in the comments. But I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Now, it is a powerful card. I do agree with that. Couldn't, especially in toolbox decks that have a lot of ways to search for Finale of Devastation, Summoner's Pact, Court of Calling. I think people will still play it in Yawgmoth, but remember, you cannot protect your Yawgmoth with it. But cool card nonetheless, and I love this card. The bangers keep coming with another reprint, Orchant. This is a single white mana for an instant. You can pay an additional white to kick it. Target player can't cast spells this turn. If the spell was kicked, creatures can't attack this turn. A lot of people may remember this card way back in the day of a deck called Scepter Chant, which is a deck that utilized Isochron Scepter, where you would put Orm's Chant on Isochron Scepter and sort of lock your opponent out of the game. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. This might come as a surprise to people, but it's probably difficult to kill people with a 2-mana artifact in today's age of Modern. So I don't know if that really is on the table anymore. But Orm's Chant, still a reasonably good sideboard card. It's good against the right type of people. It's pretty flexible, too. It's Fog or Silence, so you get both modes. And typically with cards like Silence, you only get one of those modes. So it does have a little bit more flexibility in terms of a sideboard card. So good sideboard card, but I don't see it being much more than that. I gotta say, with these names of cards, they are really hitting it out of the park. We have White of the Reliquary. I wonder what that's a reference to. This is black and a green for a 2/2 Vigilance. It gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard, and you can tap, sacrifice another creature, search your library for a land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Now, what's really important about this card is you can search for any land, not basic, not, there's no restrictions, just any land. It does come into play tapped. But again, what's cool about this card is there's 2 different ways to use this. It's either lands that make creature tokens, in which case you're not actually pumping up the white of the reliquary and you're just using it as a tutor target to find specific lands. Or you can synergize with the creature half of it, where you just play a bunch of creatures and maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 utility lands that you're getting at the end of your chain, and just making a giant white of the reliquary. What I like about this card is it specifically has vigilance. So, in the case where you're trying to pump this as big as possible and just get it to the moon in terms of stats, you can go attack with white of the reliquary, then after attacks before blocks, because it has vigilance, tap, sacrifice a creature, go get Sejiri Shelter, or Sejiri Step, I think it's called. Sejiri Step, give your white protection from a color, potentially push for a lethal attack that turn. That does require you to put Sejiri Step into your deck, which is a tapped land that only produces white mana, and this card costs black and green, so maybe a little, some deck building restrictions there, but cool card, and again, I just love the flavor of this one. What a good doggo. Filia, Exuberant Shepherd. This is 2 mana for a 2/2 flash. When it attacks, you can exile up to 1 other target non-land permanent. At the beginning of the next 10 step, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. If it entered under your control, you get a counter on Filia. This is... I don't know what to think about this one. It is legendary, so that can be a downside of sorts. Although if you're playing with Mox Amber, it could be an upside. Also, kind of cool with Mox Amber, because you can use your Mox Amber for mana and then flicker it with this, get a counter on Filia, and then have the mana on their turn, so kind of cool there. Obviously, it works well with Solitude and other things that have ETB triggers, but I don't know, it's like 2/2 for 2 that has to attack to trigger it. I guess it is kind of cool because you can use it to remove their blockers, where you can attack with this, remove their blocker, hit them for 2, and then they get their blocker back. But there's 2 problems with that. 1, you're not putting counter on Filia, and 2, you're not really doing anything with it. It's just a 2/2 unblockable for 2, which you wouldn't play. So it's a cool card, but I don't know. The fact that it has to attack to trigger kind of turns me off a little bit, but there definitely could be something there. Kudo, King Among Bears. I guess you could call this the hate bear of the set. It's green and a white for a 2/2. Legendary creature bear, and it says other creatures have base power and toughness 2/2 and are bears in addition to their other types. Is this good? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. I feel like this has potential, but it almost feels like it's not really a hate bear as much as it is an anthem if you're making a bunch of 1/1s that you're turning them into 2/2s. Because the creatures still have the abilities and stats. Or not the stats, but they still have the abilities, rather. So their Atraxa is still lifelink, death touch, vigilance, whatever, who cares. I don't know. I mean, you are shrinking Atraxa in that specific scenario, but if the creatures on the battlefield are relatively small anyways, this doesn't really have a lot of impact. It doesn't do that much. I don't know. This one's weird to me. Again, let me know in the comments. I'm not sure about this one, but it's a good bear nonetheless. There are 4 cards that have not been discussed yet, and I have saved those for last. So the first up is Kacaner, and this was one of the cards that got initially leaked, and a lot of people thought it was going to be a commander card, not in the actual set, but here we are. Kacaner. For those of you who are not familiar with the card, it's 6 mana for a 4/4 with Improvise, which means you're effectively not affinity quite, but your artifacts can help cast this. It has Ward 4, so might as well have Hexproof at that point. And when it or another artifact enters the battlefield, put a counter on it, and it can't be blocked this turn. There have been a lot of decks popping up recently in Modern that feature Experimental Synthesizer, because that card works very well with Frogmite, Mirror Enforcer, Thought Monitor, Sojourner's Companion, etc., etc. And all of those cards happen to work extremely well with Kacaner, on top of the fact that Kacaner is a 6 mana card for the synthesizer itself, and the synthesizer triggers the Kacaner. So this is just a shoo-in for those decks. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, does this make those particular decks powerful enough? Time will tell on that, but this card is extremely busted. It's good enough to be a 4 of in Legacy decks, and I would not be surprised if this was a huge fixture of all of the affinity decks, and I wouldn't be surprised if this actually made them a very good, viable, competitive archetype. And, I have a soft spot for affinity, so I'm very excited for this card, even though time will tell whether or not it was a mistake. Speaking of mistakes, Winter Moon. This is a 2-mana artifact. It says players can't untap more than 1 non-basic land during their untap steps. So for those of you who are, maybe were born in the last 20 years or so, you may not be familiar with a card called Winter Orb, which was an extremely, extremely good fixture of competitive tournament play way back in the day. Now, I don't know if 2024, like, is Winter Orb past its prime? Like, if they just printed straight up Winter Orb in Modern, would it be good? This is, not quite the same. But it's arguably better because you can build your deck to have more basic lands. Like if you're playing a monocolor deck, say something like Merfolk or some sort of mono red goblins deck. If you're playing a monocolor deck, this card is absurd because if you're playing with mostly basic lands, then this is just completely one-sided, right? The question is, are those decks playable? What is the sacrifice? Gives me a bunch of basic lands. Obviously, time will tell on this one. It reads very powerful to me. I know how good Winter Orb was back in the day. And again, maybe Modern is too fast for a card like this, where even if people are only untapping one land, they're casting 2 mana 5/5s and 2 mana 4/4s with 17 different abilities, or they're paying 1 mana to evoke their grief. Again, I'm not sure how effective this is, but it reads powerful, and I would not be surprised if it ended up being extremely powerful. But this is one where I definitely want to hear your comments on in the comment section down below. Second to last here, Flare of Denial. This is another one of those cards that I saw early on in the leaks. To be honest with you, I thought it was fake, but here we are. This is 1 blue for an instant, and this is the new pitch spell cycle, which says you may sacrifice a non-token blue creature rather than pay this spell's mana cost. Counter target spell. If you can sacrifice a non-token blue creature, you just get a free counter spell. And this one is not restrictive to non-creature like Force of Negation, and you can also do it on your opponent's turn and your turn. So it's, not restrictive in the same way of negation. Again, this is another one of those, time will tell. This card reads extremely broken. When I look at this card and I read it and I read it again and I read it again, in my head, I'm thinking this is busted. But again, the cost of playing with a lot of non-token blue creatures and the cost of like finding one blue creature that's good to sacrifice, you have to play with cheap blue creatures, I think Merfolk and things like that. Now, you can fudge the numbers a little bit with Leyline at the Guild Pack because that turns all of your creatures into blue creatures, but even then, you still have to find something to sacrifice to it. You're not going to want to sacrifice your Scion of Draco with a Leyline in play just to counter their spell. You're going to beat them with your Scion anyways. So the tricky part with this card is finding good things to sacrifice to it, or potentially just building, again, like this just Leyline soup deck where everything is blue and you just play Stitcher Supplier and sacrifice your Stitcher Supplier to this card or something like that. I don't know if that's a good idea, but I will just tell you that when I look at this card, it reads extremely powerful. Let me know what you think of this card down below. And folks, last but certainly not least, you know that I had to make you wait until the end of the video to give my thoughts on this card, because what are they doing? What are they doing with this card? Ugan's Labyrinth. This is a land. It's not legendary, which is absurd to me. It has imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile a colorless card with mana value 7 or greater from your hand. Can anybody think of a good colorless card with 7 mana value that every single deck or almost every single deck is playing? Now, again, I don't know if it's going to be good with Scion Draco, but in any case, the rest of the card is tap, add a colorless. If a card is exiled with Ugan's Labyrinth, add 2 colorless instead, and you could tap to return the exiled card to its owner's hand. I don't even know what to say. Again, this reads extremely broken to me. You can turn 1 Chalice the Void. If you have Leyline, you can go opening hand Leyline, a Labyrinth, pitch a Scion, tap the Labyrinth, cast my Scion on turn 1. Now, granted, you probably don't want to do that because you're exiling the Scion, which you could just cast on turn 2, so there's a bit of weird stuff there. But even not in Leyline Scion decks, you could just play this in Eldrazi-tron or Normaltron, decks which have a plethora of things to exile to this. I think specifically Eldrazi-tron is where I see this card being phenomenal, because you can go Labyrinth, exile something, turn 1, Chalice of the Void, which is something that we haven't seen in Modern because they ban Rite of Flame, Simian Spirit Guide, Chrome Mox, all that stuff is gone. Mox Opal, all that. Every one of the mana accelerants is gone. So this is really the only way that we've had the turn 1, I guess, Gemstone Caverns, but that doesn't really count. Yeah, I don't know. This card seems completely broken to me. I can't believe that Again, I'm willing to be wrong on this one, but one, I can't believe it's legendary, and two, also you get to return the exiled card, and you don't have to pay mana. So what's cool about this is, like, let's say you have 2 7-drops in your opening hand, and you don't have Tron or you don't have mana to cast them. You exile one to the Labyrinth, use the Labyrinth mana burst to put a Chalice and a Thought-Knot Seer into play, and then even for some reason they don't die to your turn 1 Chalice, turn 2 Thought-Knot Seer, you just get to put your big thing back in your hand later. This card just seems completely insane to me. And I definitely want to hear what you think about this card and all of the cards that were talked about in today's video. This set looks like it is shaping up to be quite possibly a lot of broken cards, perhaps the most broken set that we've seen in quite some time. But be sure to let me know what you thought in the comment section down below. How excited are you to get turn 1 Chalice? And with all of that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.